The year was 295 BCE, and Rome was in a state of fear. Their enemies had come together in a massive alliance in order to fight back against the ever-growing Italic power. The collective of Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls was in the field, and the allies and people of Rome were quite afraid of what was to come. Already numerous raids had been launched into Roman territory, and with the fear of such a massive enemy army, an emergency levy was enforced. Additionally, a double consular army was dispatched to confront the alliance. They left immediately to return to a legion that had been left behind in enemy territory, but as they approached, Gallic horsemen rode up beside their column, taunting them, singing war songs, and showing off trophies and heads from the Roman dead. The men bitterly hastened their march, and arrived at the detached legion in a desperate attempt to save them and to break the encirclement, but they were too late. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to arrive in time when the final troops were defeated on the hill. Upon seeing the reinforcing legions, the Gauls decided to withdraw in order to regroup with the rest of the army. They marched to a flat plain near the town of Sentinum and prepared for battle. The stage was set for a decisive fight. The Romans hungry to avenge their recently slain countrymen, and the coalition wanted to crush a shared enemy. The consuls followed up, crossing the Apennine Mountains, and set their camp up about 4 miles away. While they set up their camp, the enemy army of the four nations came together to discuss their plan of battle. They decided to split up into two camps, the Gauls and Samnites in one, the Umbrians and the Etruscans in the other. Next, they determined that on the day of the battle, the Gauls and the Samnites would engage in the main fight against the Romans, while the Umbrians and Etruscans would attack the Roman camp and hopefully surround them as the battle developed. However, unfortunately for the coalition, 3 deserters snuck away from their camp during the night, betraying their allies and going over to the Roman side. They met with the consuls and informed them of what was going to happen during the fight. These deserters were well rewarded and sent back with orders to return if the plan changed at all. With this extremely useful intel gained from the traitors, the consuls met to discuss what to do next, and they decided to send messengers to the legions stationed on Rome's borders, with orders to bring their armies up to Clusium and to pillage as far as they possibly could. Those legions advanced into the enemy territory, raiding it as they went. The idea was to draw off some of the Grand Alliance to raid against them, to better the odds in Rome's favor. The plan worked, and the Etruscan and Umbrian portion of the army abandoned the field and rushed back to defend their families and homes. With half the army out of the way, the Romans immediately sent forth skirmishers to harass the enemy camp and to attempt to draw them out to fight. The Gauls and the Samnites were now not quite as enthusiastic about a battle, having lost nearly half of their army, and they decided to stay on the defensive, in hopes of their allies returning. With their plan that most likely would have determined the outcome of the battle crushed, they knew that it would no longer be a quick and bloodless victory for their side, if they fought it without them. Skirmishing continued for the duration of the first day, and happened similarly on the second, with seemingly minimal results. Both sides had lost a few men to the encounters, and it looked like the Samnites and Gauls would not be provoked to fight. But finally, on the third day, both sides marched out in full force onto the plain to do battle. The Roman side was around 40,000 men strong, with the allied legions making up half of that number. The exact number of Gallic and Samnite warriors was not recorded by Livy, but most likely it was of similar or greater size than the Romans, as he tells us that the consuls were quite worried about the numbers which they were up against. The levies would have made up the screen for the Roman side, as the youngest troops, equipped with javelins, small shields, and light armor. They didn't group up in any specific formation, but rather as a mass of individuals that started in the front throwing their weapons at the enemy to tire them, but also hiding the Roman formation. When the enemy neared, they would have pulled back to perform a number of different tasks. They could have supported the cavalry, attended to the wounded, or in dire situations, even filled gaps in the melee. Next, the Astati. The second youngest troops made up the first line of melee infantry, and in this period they are equipped with spears, large rectangular shields, helmets with feathers affixed to make them appear taller, and small breastplates designed to protect the vitals. After them came the Principes, slightly older and more wealthy individuals who more or less had the same kit, but with better protective armor. Next, the Triarii in the back were the grizzled veterans, armed with large spears, shields, and the most armor. Finally, on the flanks were the Roman Equites, armed with spears, round-shaped shields, and often wore helmets, but little to no chest armor, many wearing just tunics. In addition to the Roman Equites, there were 1,000 allied companion cavalry who joined Fabius on the right flank. The two Roman generals differed in how they planned to lead their sides, with Fabius deciding to stay on the defensive and advising his fellow consul Decius to do the same, as he knew the Gauls and Samnites had the tendency to make a ferocious opening charge and to slowly wither away as the fight went on. While the two armies were standing ready to engage, Livy tells us the story of a deer driven by a wolf from the mountains, running down between the two armies, with the wolf pursuing it. Here we're told that each went a different direction, the deer to the Gauls and the wolf to the Romans. Way was made for the wolf between the ranks, however the Gauls speared the deer. When one of the soldiers in the front rank saw this, he shouted, "In that place where you see the creature sacred to Diana lying dead, flight and carnage will begin. Here, the wolf, whole and unhurt, a creature sacred to Mars, reminds us of our founder, Romulus, and that we too are of the family of Mars." While this story is in all likelihood, at the very least, a complete exaggeration, it is probable that the Romans did see a wolf that day and took it as a good omen. The Gauls were stationed to the left of the Romans and the Samnites to the right. Fabius positioned the 1st and the 3rd legions on the right wing facing the Samnites, while Decius had the 5th and 6th on the Roman left, matched up against the Gauls. The two sides would have come together in an overall skirmish with an exchange of missiles before the melee, in order to screen their own and to tire the enemy. The youngest troops on both sides sprinting forward and tossing javelins and other projectiles at each other. Following this preliminary skirmish, they would have retired behind the rest of the army. After this, the frontline infantry methodically advanced up towards each other, drumming their weapons on their shields as they approached. Much to Fabius' dismay, Decius wanted to win a quick and glorious victory, and inspired by the omen, commanded his side forwards in a violent charge when they neared the enemy line. The Astati came in with a fearsome war cry, both sides slamming into each other at the run, and the Romans battered the Gauls with their heavy shields and stabbed with their spears in the brutal combat that ensued. It was now an intense contest, with the Gauls and the Romans evenly matched against each other on the left side. The melee continued for some time, with many on both sides being killed, and after a while, the Principes were sent up to reinforce the exhausted and wounded Astati in an attempt to turn the tide. Despite the Principes having reinforced the front line, it was not enough, and the slogging match continued. Decius was becoming frustrated by the current speed of the fight, and he made the bold decision to put himself at the head of a squadron of his best cavalry. He shouted to them about the glory they would receive from turning the tide of the battle, and the Roman cavalry charged headlong into the opposing Gallic horsemen. Initially, they had great success. They fought with valor, having been encouraged by their commander, and were able to push the Gallic cavalry back twice over. However, they ended up making the mistake of overextending themselves. They became encircled, and were now in a desperate fight for their lives. As it looked like things could not possibly get any worse to them, they heard the thundering noise of clattering wheels, and saw armed men on chariots charging headlong into them. The Roman horses, which were terrified by the sounds, panicked, and the cavalry, which had been previously barely holding on, was finally thrown into an all-out rout, with many of them being trampled, and others crashing uncontrollably into their own infantrymen. Having been already exhausted, and now having chariots and their own cavalry crashing into their lines, the Roman infantry was in disarray. The Gauls did not hesitate to take advantage of this opportunity, and they surged ahead with a fierce attack, which sent many of the already battered Roman infantry into flight. Decius rode alongside the fleeing infantrymen, shouting at them, asking what hope they had in fleeing, and he did his best to recall the scattered soldiers, but to no avail. The line was crumbling fast, and a drastic action was needed. He invoked the name of his father and said, "Why do I delay the destined fate of my family? Now I will offer the legions to the enemy, together with myself, as a sacrifice to Tellus and the Demanes." He was about to undertake devotio, an extreme act where a general would sacrifice themselves in the hopes of divine intervention. Yet his priests said the required prayers, and he said the following words: "I carry before me terror, rout, carnage, blood, and the wrath of all the gods, those above and those below. I will infect the standards, the armor, the weapons of the enemy with dire and manifold death. The place of my destruction shall also witness that of the Gauls and Samnites." After this curse, he spurred his horse on and charged into the densest part of the enemy line, going out in a miraculous way, immediately being killed by the missiles of the enemy. The Romans that were previously fleeing or barely holding the line, inspired by the bravery of their general, charged back into the fight, hacking at the enemy with all they had. The Gauls, especially the ones in view of the recently slain consul, were absolutely shocked by what had just happened. Some were standing seemingly paralyzed, others were throwing their missiles aimlessly. The priest who had been commissioned by Decius to act as propraetor rode up and down the lines crying out that the consul's death had freed the Romans from all danger and had given them victory. consul had saved the Roman left from its demise, but the fighting was not yet over. Both sides, completely exhausted and bloody, continued on with the fighting, the spirit and the morale of the Roman left having been reignited. Meanwhile, on the right side, Fabius' defensive approach was beginning to pay off. The Samnites were noticeably becoming weaker, both their attacks and their shouts dissipating. He ordered the reserves called up from the rear in support of his colleagues, and the officers in command of his cavalry to take their squadrons around to the side of the Samnite force and to wait for the signal. The infantry began to steadily push forward and dislodge the exhausted enemy. When Fabius saw that they weren't offering much resistance, he collected all of his reserves which he had kept for this moment, and gave the signal for both the cavalry and the infantry to charge. The horsemen drove into the Samnite line with absolute ferocity, while the infantry pressed forwards. The Samnites were unable to face the onslaught, and fled past the Gauls to the camp, abandoning their allies to fight on their own. Back on the left, the Gauls had formed up in close order behind their shields, and the infantry fight had returned to a slogging match. So the Roman staff officers gave orders for the men to gather up the javelins which were lying on the ground between the two armies, and to hurl them at the enemy's shield wall. At first, most of them stuck in the shields of the enemy with little effect, but slowly the javelins began to make an impact, and the ranks of the Gauls were thinning. Meanwhile, Fabius ordered a squadron of about 500 of his companion cavalry to ride around the battlefield and to flank the Gauls that were still holding out on the left flank. The Principes of the 3rd Legion followed behind, and when the cavalry crashed into the rear of the enemy line, they surged into the disordered Gauls and broke any remaining resistance. After this, the attention of the Romans turned to the Samnites, who had fled back to their camp, in a disordered mob trying desperately to get inside. However, not all of them were able to make it into the gate before the Romans caught up with them, and a fight developed underneath the ramparts. Somewhere amidst the fighting, the Samnite leader, Gauls Ignatius, was killed, and soon after the Samnites broke, leading to the capture of the camp. 25,000 of the enemy are reported as being killed in the fighting, along with 8,000 being taken prisoner. However, the Roman side also took considerable casualties, with Decius losing around 7,000 men, and Fabius about 1,700. After the fighting was over, Fabius sent out a search party to find Decius' body, and he was found after 2 days amongst the defeated Gauls. He solemnly paid respects to his dead colleague and gave him every mark of honor in his funeral rites, delivering a sincere oration for his fellow consul filled with praise. In the funeral procession, the soldiers sang songs of his glorious death, commemorating the ultimate sacrifice which he had performed.